Hello everybody, welcome to the episode number 10 of Take It EV. 10. In today's episode we're going to be talking about sort of very basics of charging. But before I start, just a quick thought. So we live in times where sort of the gap between common knowledge, education, whatever, and what is quite often required to stay current widens. Despite the excellent availability of such knowledge, we love quick information tips, shorter the better, but sadly that often leaves us more uninformed than we were in the first place. But I know my listeners are the curious ones, so here we go. By the way, bear with me, because even though you might think you know the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, it's always good to go back to basics when it comes to these things.
Well, I do have an issue with punctuality, I have to admit.
So I often hear questions like, how long does it take to charge? How far can you go? It's just boring these days. These are fake questions though, but usually have no idea what is the knowledge gap between the person asking it and me. They could be a professor of physics, for all I know, but equally they couldn't have heard anything about the basics of electricity since school, or none at all. And understanding those basics helps quite a lot. So, look, you wouldn't go to a petrol stations if you didn't have an understanding of what a litre is or a gallon, at least conceptually. I often get some really odd comments like, lights in the car surely drain the battery and have an effect on the range. They don't. And this is an actual quote from an actual MG salesperson at a garage. The new MG ZS EV apparently does not have fog light because it impacts the range. It doesn't. No kidding. Other times I hear people saying that surely sticking a solar panel on top of the roof will be enough to drive the car in, etc., etc. And none of these questions are wrong, really, but they all seem to stem from the lack of sort of basic understanding of electricity and physics. And fair enough, up until recent, most of us did not have to understand these things on day-to-day basis. But I think going forwards, we are all better for knowing, what a term such as voltage, amperage, watts, watt hour, amp hour, etc. mean. And what is the difference between power consumption of an EV, kettle, electric shower, a light bulb in a house or in a car? I think it's all good stuff that is good to know. Lastly, if you think you never understood any of this at school, you're not alone. But let me assure you that this broadcast has been subject to peer testing on actual people who are not technical. And of course, any comments, corrections, etc., takeitev@gmail.com, or just tweet me at takeitev, just like the name of the podcast. It's EV. Right, so let's get started. One disclaimer before I start: don't play with electricity by yourself. This is all dangerous stuff, or could be potentially dangerous stuff, and I do not take any responsibility for any issues caused after you've listened to it. It's not a manual, technical manual, and if you can't do it, or if you don't know, if you're unsure, just leave these things to pros. Okay? Cheers. So, two sort of fundamental terms that we see, whether we use electronic products or you own an EV. One of them, the first one that everyone kind of gets across, is a volt. So the name actually comes from a surname of an Italian physicist called Alessandro Volta, and I apologize to all my Italian viewers or listeners. Sorry. He is responsible for one of the first documented battery designs and many sort of definitions of battery characteristics. One of them is obviously a volt, designated by a capital letter V. Sort of the straightforward definition of voltage is a difference between electric potentials between 2 points. And I know that might sound like a lot of jib-jab, but put a pin in that and then the term, and I'm sure it will make sense later. If you imagine electricity in a very simple terms as just a bunch of electrons happily moving along from one place to another. However, since electrons are not really good at traveling through just any material, we need a conductive material like a cable wire. Now, electrons are of course not visible to a naked eye, but if you could imagine a bunch of electrons readily or sort of happily traveling through a wire from one connector to another, that's in essence what is an electric current. The willingness and the eagerness of those electrons to move through the wire is what we call an electrical potential, so a voltage. It's important to note that the electrons are not always happy to travel through a wire. Imagine two batteries. If you connect negative to a positive terminal of a single AA battery, don't try it at home. You will get a current flowing in a very hot wire. However, if you take two AA cells and connect a wire from the negative terminal of the first one of them to the positive terminal of the second one of them, you will not get any current flowing through the wire. That's because in order for the electrons to travel through the wire, we need something called a closed circuit, which is the other bit of the apart from the wire is the battery itself. So it's going to be sort of relevant later. So just again put a pin in that, and I'm going to get to it later. Which it will be one of those things that is obvious when I explain later about EVs, but let's get to it later. So anyway, this is in a nutshell voltage. It's a very arbitrary unit that we use to measure the potential. Now, once we got the electrons traveling happily through our circuit in a wire, imagine sort of cutting the wire in half, like a cutout, and looking at the live circuit and calculating how many of those electrons can travel through that cutout at any given moment. That's the number of those electrons we call a current, and just like it's the same as in a stream or a river, same principle. It's very simple. Current is for electricity is measured in amperes, which is a name that comes from another bloke's name. It's all blokes, sadly, in those days. This time a French physicist. He spent a lot of time sort of studying electromagnetism, and for one reason or another, we use his name to call the unit of electric current amperes. In common use and in physics, because you have to have a name for it, we use the capital letter A to denote current measurement. Hope this wasn't too quick, but it's all downhill from now on. Trust me, so you can relax. If any of this wasn't clear, feel free to rewind a wee bit, or just give it some time. The trouble with electric is that no one can see it, so it's tough to show it. And this is a podcast anyway, so right. So now, if you have these two essential components, a potential and a current, a voltage and amperage, we can quickly get to our most significant figure, which is the power. With electric cars and battery storage, which is where we will be applying this new knowledge. It's pretty straightforward. There's another bloke's name that we will use. It's always blokes, I'm afraid. And this guy, you might have heard of him, is called Watt. He was a Scottish fella, and he's mostly renowned for steam engines, but he's done quite a few other things. So, as you know, we use watts to measure electric power. In case of batteries and sort of DC or direct current, watts are very, very simple. You literally just take a voltage, an amperage, multiply it together, and you get a figure in watts. So I don't know, 12-volt battery that, and you have 1 amp current. That's 12 watts. Simple. Electric car batteries, of course, are most commonly, and this is like a roundout, have about 400 volts. So let's imagine a car battery that's capable of producing 10 kilowatts. That's simply 10,000 watts. Simply, so we know it's 400 volts. Divide 10,000 by 400 and you get 24 amps. Simple. Told you. So let's take an example. Your home charger, for instance, is probably capable of supplying about 7 kilowatts when charging your car. We know what voltage we have at homes, at least in the UK, and kind of most of the other world. It's 240 volts, give or take. So we can easily calculate how many amps it will output, right? Let's do a very simple calculation. I'll let you calculate that and let me know what you find out. Just send me a tweet at TakeItAV. Okay? Right, let's move along. I'll let you do that later. Keen-eyed amongst you will already be screaming at me, but my car has a battery pack with capacity of X kilowatt hours. What is that extra hour in the units for? Some of you also have cars where the manufacturer for some reason decided to specify the capacity using amp hours. Well, if there's one of you, if there's one thing you should walk away from this episode with, is that in real life, just like in physics, units are as important as values, if not more important sometimes. So yes, that hour in watt hours does really matter, and it does indeed make a difference to the watts on its own. So in fact, that means that it's an entirely different unit. Seriously, just like miles and are different from miles per hour, except that in case of watt hour, strangely, this is again, don't know why people do that, but that's the way sort of the physics people operate. They strip out the multiplication. So in miles per hour, per means a division, but in case of the multiplication, they just omit it. I don't know why. Don't ask me. So they stripped out the multiplication in the middle, so it should be watts times hour, or amperes times hour for some others.
First question I asked her was, do you ever think about electric cars? No.
But before your head explodes, it's really simple. All that means is the battery in this case is capable of delivering, say, 10 kilowatts for an hour, or 5 kilowatts for 2 hours. That's it. It's not really that hard. But what is important again is the fact that they're two different units. So remember that there's a massive distinction between kilowatts and kilowatt hours. It's the two different things, really. The simplest way to remember is the one measures the power, and the other one is measurement of capacity. If you can imagine a bucket, and if you put a hole in it, you can drain that bucket, for however many hours, minutes, whatever, to empty it. But the bucket itself has a capacity of X liters, right? It's it's the same deal. So I'm sure you know now which one is which. Your house charger does not have a capacity, and your battery isn't just a merely source of power. But could be, of course. It's easy peasy. And for those of you who are unfortunate BMW owners, for some marketing reason, probably because the number is higher, BMW has decided to provide their users with ampere hours as a capacity figure, which, as you know by now, does not mean much without knowing how much voltage we have in the pack, right? But it is a higher figure. 94 amp hours is higher than 20-something kilowatt hours. So yes, it's a marketing trick, and you now will know not to fall for it. So there you go. But Greg, I thought you're gonna tell me how, what this whole thing has to do with, if my car's light bulb can drain the battery, or if my car's fog lights can drain the battery. You should know by now that your car has X amount of kilowatt hours stored in the battery, and if a bulb that is 15 watts is on for an hour, you know that it's going to be draining 15 watt hours of of your battery pack, which leaves a huge amount of power to your drivetrain. Just a quick recap before we move on to the next segment. Volts, difference of potential. Amps, the width of the current of the stream of electrons. Again, very simple. And watts, volts times amperes. Pretty simple. Another thing that we discussed was the difference between watt hours and watts. One is a measurement of capacity and the other one is a measurement of power. Watts is just power, watt hours is capacity. Again, fairly straightforward.
Say what?
So by now you should know all these things, obviously. But let's go back to the things where I asked you to put a pin in them, not literally, obviously. So one of the most interesting questions I quite often get, and this segment of the podcast is brought to you by me just waffling, so bear with me, is what happens if one of the terminals of the battery is exposed to the chassis of the car, or a wire sticks out of the car. Chances are, if a wire sticks out of any car, it's going to be a 12 volt cable, so you're fine. You have to remember that in case of cars and electricity in general, is the voltage that kills you. It's not the amperage. So obviously, the higher the voltage, the more lethal or deadly it might be. So just be careful with that, obviously. In electric cars, the high voltage systems are usually orange, just to obviously make sure that you're aware of that they're the most dangerous ones. And remember, I told you to put a pin in a sort of test with 2 AA batteries. It's a similar principle here. So you've got a battery in the car. For the purposes of this illustration, it's just a single battery. In reality, it's if you imagine hundreds of AA batteries, that's essentially what your battery pack is. But to the outside world, is just a single battery. If you had another car and you put literally the negative terminal of one of the batteries to the positive terminal of the other battery, nothing will happen because they're not closed circuit. If your battery is insulated from the ground, so if you touch one of the terminals of your battery in your car, don't try this at home, seriously. But trust me when I say that nothing generally will happen. If you touch the ground with your other hand, or if you measure the voltage between your ground and one of the terminals of the battery, there is no connection. However, if you were to put the other terminal of the battery in the ground through a wire, obviously then there's a potential for a current to flow, and that becomes a problem because it's a 400 volt battery and that's a lot of volts. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to even attempt to do that unless you know what you're doing. And people who are doing this for a living wear serious protective gear. So just so you know. So the chances of anything happening if one of the terminals of the battery gets exposed to the outside world, touches the chassis, generally nothing will happen. in reality, what happens is that the battery pack itself in the car has some series of protective circuits that measure what's called a leakage voltage, which basically means, how much of a lot of the electricity could be very easily imagined as a sort of stream of a fluid, water flowing. It's not a one-to-one analogy, doesn't always work, but generally it's a pretty good comparison. So if you imagine a tiny little stream of water or electricity flowing to the chassis of the car, there is a circuit in a car that will detect that, and it will just shut off the battery packs, or at least it will send a warning to the driver saying, your high voltage circuit in the car has a problem. Visit a garage very quick. If it's a serious issue, it will again detect it and it will shut off the power immediately. Battery packs generally in electric cars are self-contained, and they do have usually some sort of a protective circuitry in the car, in the battery pack itself. So contactors or solenoids and fuses, and obviously if anything of those things cuts off, then your car is not going to be able to drive. Simple as that. So hopefully that answers that question, which you'll be surprised how many times I actually get that question asked.
You can't touch this.
So let's address a couple of other sort of often asked questions. Obviously, I think it should be obvious by now that the little light bulb in the car takes no power at all. And if you have a 30 kilowatt hour battery pack and a light bulb that has even 50 watts, you can easily make a calculation of how long it will take that battery to supply power to that light bulb. It will take a long time. So no turning on your lights in the car does not drain your battery enough to stop you driving, for miles. It will probably take off over an hour or 2 miles tops, and this is like a wild guess. But I invite you to make that calculation yourself, because you know the basics now, so just go wild. So another question that I get quite often is, why can't we just stick a solar panel on top of the car? So let's think about it. If you think about the size of the roof on top of a Nissan Leaf, for instance, or even a Model S, you could probably get a panel that can produce about 500 watts from that. And again, this is obviously if the sun is shining in the right, at the right angle at the right time. And again, imagine how long will it take for that to supply the power to charge your battery. It's a simple calculation. Once again, your charger at home, if it's a 7 kilowatts, that's a lot of panels basically, and they would have to be all exposed to a peak sun for you to be able to do it. So again, it's not going to work very well, is it? There's a reason why of all the cars that I know actually that have a solar panel on top of the roof, I know of a Nissan Leaf had that as an option. You had to pay I think about £300 extra, and all it does, it charges up the 12-volt battery in a car, which is sort of the service battery in a car. Which is actually another interesting question that I often get. I might actually mention that. So one of the reasons why electric cars still have a 12-volt battery is, you remember when I mentioned there's a solenoid in a battery pack that will cut off if there's any issues with the battery pack. That solenoid has to be driven by something, some power, right? And that power has to come from a 12-volt battery. It's a chicken and egg situation in this case. And I'd actually be interested in how they're going to solve that problem for, say, Model Y or or future cars that will not have the 12-volt battery. I would imagine that there's going to be a different type of a separate battery, maybe higher voltage battery. Some utility batteries in some vehicles are 48 volts, so there's nothing stopping us from having them in a car, other than the fact that loads of trinkets that are put in a car are designed from ground up to run on 12 volts. So it's obviously very convenient just to have a 12-volt battery. But anyway, I'm digressing here. So just going back on, say, solar panels. If you imagine, well, actually, another question that I get quite often is, how about putting a solar panel on top of the roof and having a battery or two batteries in a car, one that gets charged from the solar panels on the roof as you drive along, and at a convenient time you just swap those batteries around. You drain one and take the current, or you drain one, use it for drivetrain, and then you use the other battery to charge it up from the solar panels. This is probably a bit of a digression, but you don't need to do that. It's the same as you don't have to. If you imagine, again, this is a sort of analogy to water. You don't need to have two separate. You don't need to have a tank in a house that is getting water from the main supply, or two tanks in a house, and then when one of them is full, it's drained, and the other one is filled up, and then they swap around. It's one system. It's all kind of integrated. It's the same thing with current. The the fun thing about current is, and I'm not going to give you any sort of dangerous examples, but electricity or current or electrons in the that are flowing sort of through a wire, they prefer the sort of the path of the easiest the least resistance. And this is a gross sort of simplification, but if you imagine a very common example that probably everyone's familiar with, you've got a thunderstorm and you've got a lightning strike somewhere. If you look at the path of that lightning, it follows the sort of the path of least resistance. So it doesn't just go, all the way down. The electrons just kind of choose the easy path, just like humans, most of them anyway. It's the same deal. So if the battery is full, all the electrons that are sort of queued up that way, not going to allow the other electrons to go that way, so obviously it will just divert somewhere else. Very simple. It's all connected, and it's the same thing in your phone. For instance, when you plug in your phone to a charger, it's a tiny battery compared to to what is in your car, obviously. But your phone and same with the laptop, for instance, they charge at the same time, and some of the power from the wall goes into the sort of the circuitry, running the circuitry, and any sort of leftovers will charge the battery. In case of laptops, it quite often happens that if you run your laptop very, very high, all the CPUs are very busy and GPUs and all that, and you crank up your brightness on your laptop, your battery will actually be drained, even though your laptop's plugged in. It's because, again, power kind of flows where it's needed. The resistance is lower when it needs to go somewhere. All those electrons are needed somewhere else, and that's the way it will go. It's very, very simple. Let's go back to the other examples or other questions that I often get is, what about your kettle, and what if I turn the kettle on in the house and the car will surely we're just going to drain the grid. So most houses in the UK have a supply of 100 amps to the house, a single phase 100 amp. That's at 240 volts. You can do the calculation yourself now. You know how many watts it is, or kilowatts, because it's a lot of power, right? So your car, actually, I'm going to do this calculation as I speak, which is not bad, but so we got this we got this. So we got 24 kilowatts. Out of that, we need 7,000 to charge the car. We're left with 17. We put the kettle on. Kettle takes about 3 kilowatts. 1, 2, 3. We're left with 14. We put the oven on. Oven uses about 2. We're left with 12 kilowatts. Let's put the electric shower on. Some of them actually use 5 kilowatts, so oops. 2, 3. We're still left with 7 kilowatts. And guess what? Things like microwaves, kettles, any sort of loads like that, they're not linear loads. Unlike your car, which is charging at 7 kilowatts constant for the majority of the time when you charge the battery when it's drained. Things like your kettle or your microwave or your oven, they only need as much energy as is required to sort of to bump the heat in wherever they're heating up. So the loads are going to vary. It's going to kind of jump up and down. So as you can see, you can do this calculation yourself. But I've done this very quick calculation, and you're still left with 7 kilowatts. And guess what? If you had 2 electric cars plugged in at the same time, you could still charge the other one at the same time. So not a problem. And generally your loads like that, they're not going to be on for hours, unlike your electric car. So not an issue. I think looking at the time, I've been talking for half an hour now, and I'm sure you get the gist now, right? Anyway, what can I say? Hopefully that answers quite a lot of questions and kind of gives you a bit more of understanding, and don't ever feel like this is complicated or this is advanced knowledge. Basics like the voltages and the current, those are basics for a reason. They're fairly easy to grasp, and I think going forwards into the future, this should be something that everyone should be capable of understanding, and you don't need to be a maths genius or a physicist to get these things, seriously. Alright, you beautiful people, that's it for the episode 15. Hope you liked it. I am trying to get guests on the podcast because it's a bit lonely by myself. But the times are tough. You think that now that I'm recording this podcast on the 30th of March, there's going to be many people who will have plenty of time, but people are busy actually, it turns out. But I'm still here for you. Hopefully today's broadcast was nice and interesting and informative. And even if you know these things, hopefully you've learned something new or you've just been entertained. I do hope to record more of these sort of things in the future, but the next couple of episodes, I do hope, fingers crossed, we're just gonna have guests. It's always nice to know what's out there. But today, for me, thank you very much for listening, and if you're not subscribed, subscribe, and let others know what you think about this podcast, and if you found this valuable, share it. Okay? And as always, thank you very much for listening, and subscribe. Say hi at TakeItEV on Twitters. Send me an email, takeitev@gmail.com, and stay safe out there. Times are changing, right? Bye.
Take it easy.